The courtroom went still the second my father stood up. His voice didn't shake. It didn't crack. No benefits. No compensation. He said loud enough for the back row to hear. "She's a fake veteran." A few people gasped. Someone laughed nervously. I felt every eye swing toward me as if I were a stain someone had just noticed on a clean floor. Then the doors behind me opened, and I stepped forward in my uniform. The judge froze. His hand trembled against the bench as he whispered almost to himself, "My God, is that really her?" And my father went silent. 2 days earlier, none of this had existed yet. No courtroom, no uniform, no word like fake hanging in the air like a bad smell that wouldn't go away. I was in my kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, making coffee strong enough to bite back. The morning light came in thin through the blinds, catching dust I kept meaning to wipe away. My dog Rusty lay near the door, his back leg stretched out stiff the way it always was now. He lifted his head when the mail slot clanged. I didn't rush to it. Bills usually came on Fridays. Ads. Church flyers from towns I hadn't lived in for years. When I finally bent down, the envelope stood out immediately, cream-colored, heavier than the rest, stamped with a county seal I recognized from childhood. The kind you don't open casually. I set it on the table and stared at it longer than I care to admit. When I finally tore it open, the words didn't make sense at first. Administrative hearing. Veterans Affairs Review. Allegation of fraudulent claim. Fraudulent. I sat down hard, the chair scraping louder than it should have. Rusty limped over and rested his head on my knee. His weight was familiar, steady, real. Someone had formally accused me of lying about my service. At the bottom of the page there was a line that explained the basis of the complaint. It named a witness, a primary source. My father. I laughed then. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes the body does strange things when the mind refuses to cooperate. It came out dry and sharp like it scraped something on the way up. Of course I said out loud to no one. It had been 11 years since I'd left home. 11 years since the last real conversation with him, if you could even call it that. He'd stood in the driveway, arms crossed, telling me I was embarrassing myself. That women like me didn't belong in uniform. That I was chasing attention. "You want to play soldier, don't drag this family into it," he'd said. I stopped expecting understanding after that. I folded the letter and unfolded it again, reading every line this time. The allegation claimed I had never served, that I had falsified records to obtain medical benefits, that I was exploiting a system meant for real veterans. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, county courthouse, public proceeding. They weren't just questioning paperwork, they were questioning who I was. I got up and walked down the narrow hallway to the spare bedroom. Most people would have called it storage. To me, it was the one place I hadn't reorganized to look like a civilian life. The old footlocker sat against the wall, paint-chipped corners dented from moves I barely remembered. I knelt and opened it. The smell came first, metal, old fabric, something like oil and dust. Inside, everything was folded the way it always had been. Careful, intentional. The uniform lay on top, dark and heavy buttons, dulled with time, but still straight. Beneath it were documents in a worn folder. Orders, medical reports, discharge papers, proof I'd never needed before. I hadn't worn the uniform since the day I left active duty. That was on purpose. I didn't want it mistaken for a costume. I didn't want it questioned. But now it had been questioned anyway. Rusty watched from the doorway as I lifted the jacket, my hands slower than I expected. The fabric still held its shape. The weight of it pulled at my shoulders even before I put it on. "They think I made you up," I told him quietly. "All of it." He wagged his tail once, uneven and hopeful. I thought about calling my mother. I imagined her voice tightening the way it always did when she tried to keep peace where there wasn't any. "Your father didn't mean it like that." I didn't dial. Instead, I called the number on the letter. "Yes, ma'am," the clerk confirmed politely. "Your father submitted a sworn statement challenging your eligibility. You're required to appear in person if you wish to contest the claim." Contest. As if this were a disagreement over property lines. As if the last decade of my life were up for debate. I thanked her and hung up. That afternoon I drove past my parents' house without stopping. The porch looked smaller than I remembered. The flag out front hung limp, tangled around itself. I wondered if my father ever looked at it and thought about what it meant, or if it was just something he'd always put up because that's what men like him did. That night I sat at the kitchen table long after the coffee went cold. I read through every page in that folder, checking dates, signatures, stamps. I didn't need to. I knew they were right. Still, I checked. What hurt wasn't the accusation, it was who it came from. When I finally went to bed, sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept circling back to that one sentence I imagined him saying under oath. "She's a fake," as if I were a story he could rewrite by repeating it often enough. By morning, the decision had already been made. I took the uniform from the footlocker and laid it out on the bed. I brushed off the dust. I pinned each ribbon where it belonged, not to impress anyone, not to prove anything. But because if my father was going to erase me in public, I wasn't going to show up as half a person. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time once it was on. The jacket fit tighter now. The lines on my face were deeper. But the reflection didn't look like a stranger. "Let's get this on the record," I said softly. Rusty barked once as I grabbed my keys. Outside, the morning was clear and unremarkable, the kind of day where nothing looks wrong until it suddenly is. People think service is loud. They picture flags snapping in the wind metals, catching sunlight speeches with polished words and steady applause. What they don't picture are the years in between the quiet ones where nothing happens except the slow work of keeping things from falling apart. I served in logistics, not the kind that makes headlines. I wasn't kicking down doors or standing in front of cameras. I planned routes, counted supplies, made sure convoys arrived where they were supposed to when they were supposed to, with everyone inside still breathing. If I did my job right, no one ever noticed. That suited me just fine. My first deployment taught me that quickly. You learn how fragile systems are when you're responsible for them. One missed fuel drop, one misread coordinate, and suddenly people don't come home. I learned to triple-check everything, to sleep lightly, to listen for sounds that didn't belong. There was a night overseas when the power went out across the compound. No warning, just darkness and the low hum of generators struggling to catch up. Someone cracked a joke to break the tension. I didn't laugh. I was already running numbers in my head how long we could operate if the backup failed, who needed to move first if it did. Later, when it was over, someone told me I should have been scared. I just didn't have time to show it. My injury came years later during a training exercise stateside. Not dramatic, no explosion. A vehicle malfunction, a bad landing, a sharp pain that didn't fade the way it was supposed to. They rebuilt the knee as best they could, but it never went back to what it was. Cold weather made it ache. Stairs took longer. I learned to live with it the way you live with anything permanent, by adjusting and not talking about it. When I was discharged, the paperwork was clean, honorable, medical, quiet, no ceremony, no one waiting at the gate. I didn't tell my parents right away. By then, we barely spoke. My mother sent texts on holidays. My father didn't send anything at all. The first time I tried to explain what I did years earlier, he cut me off halfway through the sentence. "So you move boxes," he said flatly. "That's not service." I didn't correct him. I didn't argue. I learned early that facts didn't matter when someone had already decided who you were. I rented a small place after I got out. Fixed things around the house when I could. Took work where it was offered. I kept my records in order because that's what you do when you've spent years inside systems that punish mistakes. I filed for medical coverage when the pain became something I couldn't ignore. Filled out the forms honestly, mailed them in, forgot about them. Until someone else remembered. The allegation didn't come out of nowhere. That's what people think when they hear stories like this, that it's some random bureaucratic glitch. It wasn't. It was personal. A neighbor told me later they'd seen my father at the county office weeks earlier, asking questions, saying my name out loud like it belonged to him again. He must have learned about the benefits then, about the paperwork, about the fact that his daughter, who he told people had gone nowhere, was listed as a veteran in official records. I imagine that burned. By the time the letter arrived, he'd already decided what story he was going to tell. That I'd exaggerated, that I'd fooled someone, that I was using a uniform I didn't earn to get something I didn't deserve. When I read his sworn statement attached to the file, the words were neat and confident. He wrote like a man who'd never doubted himself. She was never deployed. She never talked about it because there was nothing to talk about. My daughter has always wanted attention. I read that line 3 times. Rusty lay at my feet as I went through the rest of the documents, his breathing slow and uneven. Outside, a lawnmower droned somewhere down the block. Ordinary life went on, unaware that mine was being dismantled sentence by sentence. What struck me wasn't the anger. That came later. What struck me was how easily he'd erased the years between who I was and who he wanted me to be. How cleanly he'd written me out of a life he didn't approve of. I thought about the nights I'd spent staring at ceilings I didn't recognize, the people I'd met whose names I still remembered but never spoke, the routines that kept everyone else alive and me awake. None of it mattered, apparently. I spent the rest of the weekend gathering what I'd need. I printed copies of everything, labeled folders, slipped them into a plain binder. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't need one. This wasn't about arguing interpretation. It was about establishing fact. Sunday night I laid the uniform out again. Not the dress version, just the service one. Clean, simple, honest. I hesitated before packing it. There was a part of me that wanted to walk into that courthouse in jeans and a jacket to prove I didn't need symbols. But another part, the one shaped by years of following orders that made sense only after the fact knew better. You don't hide when the truth is enough. I zipped the garment bag and set it by the door. Rusty watched me from the couch, ears perked. "We're going to town tomorrow," I told him. "I'll be back." He wagged his tail once, then settled again, trusting me to return the way he always had. That night I barely slept. Not from fear exactly, from anticipation. The kind that tightens your chest because you know something is about to end one way or another. By morning my mind was steady. Whatever my father planned to say, I would be there to hear it. And this time the record wouldn't be written without me in the room. The drive into town took less than 40 minutes, but it felt longer. Not because of traffic, there wasn't any, but because every mile peeled back something I'd carefully folded away. Old storefronts. A gas station that still smelled like oil and burnt coffee. The diner where my father used to take us on Sundays, his voice loud over the clatter of plates, telling anyone who would listen what his kids were going to be someday. I parked across from the courthouse and shut off the engine. The ticking sound it made as it cooled felt louder than it should have. My knee throbbed faintly, a reminder I didn't need. I sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, breathing the way I'd been taught to when things got tight. Slow in, slower out. The courthouse looked smaller than I remembered, brick worn pale by decades of sun and rain. The flag out front was raised, the rope tapping lightly against the pole in the breeze. A janitor was sweeping the steps when I got out of the car. He glanced up, his eyes catching on the garment bag in my hand. "Morning," he said, nodding. "Morning," I replied. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and floor polish, the kind of smell that never really leaves a building once it settles in. People sat on wooden benches, murmuring in low voices. A woman clutched a folder to her chest like it might run away. A man paced near the wall tie, loosened jaw tight. No one noticed me at first. Then I stepped forward to check in. The clerk looked up, opened her mouth to speak, and stopped. Her eyes dropped briefly, then came back to my face. She swallowed. "You're here for the hearing?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." She typed something into the computer, her fingers slower now. "You can take a seat. They'll call your case shortly." I nodded and moved toward the benches. As I walked, I felt the shift. The quiet kind, conversations tapering off, the subtle turning of heads. A uniform does that in small towns. Not admiration exactly, more like recognition mixed with curiosity. I chose a seat near the back and sat straight, hands resting on my knees. Years of habit don't fade easily. My father was already there. He sat near the front shoulders, squared hands folded neatly in his lap. He wore the same dark jacket he always did to church, pressed within an inch of its life. My mother sat beside him, posture perfect, purse, clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. He didn't look back right away. When he finally did, his eyes slid over me, pausing just long enough to register the uniform. His mouth curved not into a smile exactly, but into something close, as if he'd already won. I looked away first. The bailiff stepped out and called for everyone to rise. The judge entered, an older man with gray hair and a face lined more by patience than by anger. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the room. His gaze stopped on me. He stared longer than politeness allowed, long enough that I noticed his hand tighten slightly on the edge of the bench, long enough that he had to clear his throat before speaking. "Be seated," he said. The hearing began the way these things always do, formal language procedural steps, names read into the record. My father's attorney spoke first, confident and rehearsed. "This matter concerns an allegation of fraudulent representation of military service," he said. "Specifically that the claimant falsely asserted veteran status in order to obtain benefits to which she is not entitled." I listened without reacting. I'd heard worse things said in places with fewer chairs. The judge nodded once. "Call your witness." My father stood. He walked to the stand with the ease of a man used to being listened to. He didn't look at me as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. When he sat, he folded his hands again just like he had on the bench. The attorney asked him to state his name and relationship to me. "I'm her father," he said. "I raised her." That word "raised" hung there for a moment longer than necessary. "And you're asserting that your daughter did not serve in the military?" "That's correct," my father said without hesitation. "She left home years ago, said she was joining up. But there was never any proof, no letters, no stories, nothing. Now she's claiming benefits and I know my own child. She's a fake." A murmur rippled through the room. "No benefits, no compensation," he added louder now as if volume could replace evidence. "She's not a real veteran." I felt my chest tighten, not from the words themselves, but from the certainty behind them. He wasn't angry, he wasn't confused. He was sure. The judge leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving my father's face. "And what is this knowledge based on?" he asked. "I'm her father," my father repeated. "If she'd really served, I'd know." The judge turned his head slowly and looked at me again. That was when it happened. His gaze dropped not to my face but to the insignia on my chest, to the placement of the ribbons, to the small details most people miss. His hand trembled. It wasn't dramatic. Just a slight shake, the kind you notice only if you're looking for it. He leaned forward, squinting, then whispered, barely audible but close enough for the front row to hear. "My God, is that really her?" He didn't say my name, he didn't need to. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from before, less curious, more expectant. The judge cleared his throat again and looked back at my father. "We'll return to your testimony shortly," he said. "For now, I'd like to hear from the claimant." He turned to me. "Ma'am?" I stood. The floor felt solid under my feet. My knee protested, but the pain was familiar, manageable. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "Do you wish to respond to the allegation?" "Yes, sir, I do." I walked to the table, set my binder down, and opened it. The sound of the metal rings clicking echoed louder than it should have. "I brought documentation," I said evenly. "Service records, medical discharge papers, pay stubs, all verified." My father shifted in his seat. The judge nodded once. "Proceed." As I slid the first document across the table, I didn't look at my father. I didn't need to. For the first time since this had begun, the room wasn't waiting for him anymore. It was waiting for the truth. Paper has a sound when it's moved in a quiet room, a dry sliding whisper. That sound followed each document as I placed it on the table one by one, careful not to rush. I didn't explain right away. I let the judge see them first. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "this is my DD 214, Honorable Medical Discharge, date service number unit designation." He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. The courtroom stayed still. Even my father stopped shifting. "This next file contains deployment orders and after-action reports," I continued. My role was logistics coordination, route planning, supply management. I didn't carry a rifle most days. I carried maps. A faint crease appeared between the judge's brows, not confusion but recognition. He turned a page, then another. "And this," I said, sliding a thicker packet forward, "is my medical record. The injury occurred during a stateside training exercise. Documented, reviewed, approved." The judge took his time. He always did. That I would later learn was part of why people trusted him. My father's attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, paperwork can be fabricated. We're here because—" "Counsel," the judge interrupted calmly without looking up, "I will ask when I need commentary." The attorney sat back. The judge finally looked at me. "You filed for benefits when—" "3 years ago, sir." "And prior to that?" "I managed the injury on my own. It worsened over time." He nodded, eyes returning to the page. And your father's assertion is that none of this occurred? Yes, sir. The judge turned toward my father again. Mr. Harris, he said, using my father's name for the first time, have you ever seen any of these documents before today? My father hesitated. It was subtle, but it was there. No, he said, because she never showed them to me. That wasn't my question, the judge replied evenly. Have you ever asked to see them? My father's jaw tightened. I didn't believe they existed. The judge set his glasses down slowly. Belief is not evidence. A few heads nodded in the gallery. Someone shifted on a bench. The room seemed to breathe again. I want to be very clear, the judge continued. This court does not adjudicate family disagreements. We adjudicate facts. So I'm going to ask one more time. On what basis are you claiming your daughter falsified military service? My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. She left, he said finally. She stopped calling, stopped coming home. People who really serve talk about it. They bring it with them. I looked down at my hands. The scars on my knuckles were faint, now easy to miss. Some do, the judge said. Some don't. He turned to the clerk. Would you please retrieve the verification from the federal records? The clerk nodded and left the room. The door closed softly behind her. The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. My father stared straight ahead, his posture stiff as if he were bracing against something he couldn't yet see. The judge leaned back, folding his hands. His gaze drifted to me again, lingering on the details, the precise placement of insignia, the worn edges of fabric that came from use, not costume. Commander, he said suddenly. The word echoed. My father's head snapped toward him. What did you just call her? The judge didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on me. Is that still your rank? Yes, sir, I said quietly. A flicker passed through his expression, something like memory. I thought so, he murmured. The clerk returned, handing him a folder. He opened it, scanning the contents. His thumb paused on a page, then another. I remember now he said more to himself than anyone else. There was an evacuation operation, 5 years ago. Coastal flooding, civilian and military coordination. My father frowned. What does that have to do with this? The judge looked up sharply. It has everything to do with this. He turned the folder so the seal was visible to the room. This verification confirms her service, her role, and her discharge status. It also includes commendation notes from a joint task force. A low murmur spread through the benches. My father's attorney stood again, face tight. Your Honor, even if she served, the question remains whether... The judge raised a hand. Sit down. The attorney did. The judge's voice softened, but it carried. Ms. Harris, were you involved in the evacuation of Bay Point Harbor during the 2018 storm? Yes, sir. You coordinated transport routes when the primary access roads failed? Yes. And you remained on site after sustaining an injury until all civilians were cleared? I swallowed. Yes, sir. The judge nodded slowly. I was there. Not in uniform. As a civilian volunteer with the county. I remember a woman who didn't raise her voice once, just kept moving people where they needed to go. He paused, then said it again, this time clearly, firmly. My God, it really is you. The room went utterly silent. My father stared at the judge, then at me. His mouth opened slightly. No words came out. The judge straightened all business now. This court finds no basis for the allegation of fraudulent military service. The claimant's records are verified. The accusation is dismissed. He brought the gavel down once. The sound was sharp, final. My father didn't sit. He couldn't. His hands trembled at his sides, his certainty collapsing into something smaller, thinner. He looked like a man who'd stepped forward expecting solid ground and found air instead. I gathered my papers calmly, my movements precise. My hands shook, but not from fear, from release. As I turned to leave the table, the judge spoke again quietly. Ms. Harris. I stopped. You conducted yourself with restraint today, he said. That matters. I nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. I didn't look at my father as I walked past him. I didn't need to. His silence said everything his words never had. The sound of the gavel lingered longer than it should have. Not because it echoed, this courtroom had heard thousands of them, but because no one moved to cover it with noise. The benches stayed still. The attorney didn't shuffle papers. Even the air felt like it was waiting for permission to move again. My father remained standing. At first I thought he might argue, that he'd find his voice and try to claw something back with it. He'd done that my entire life, turning volume into authority, confidence into certainty. But now his mouth opened and closed without sound, as if the language he'd relied on had suddenly abandoned him. The judge watched him carefully. "Mr. Harris," he said not unkindly, "you may step down." My father didn't respond. The bailiff took one quiet step forward. That was all it took. My father lowered himself back into the chair as if gravity had finally remembered him. His shoulders slumped just slightly. The man who had once filled every room he entered now seemed to shrink inside his own jacket. My mother hadn't moved the entire time. Her hands were still locked around her purse, but her eyes were on me now. Not sharp, not accusing, just wide as if she were seeing a photograph she hadn't known existed. The judge turned his attention back to the bench, his voice returning to its measured cadence. "For the record," he said, "the claimant's eligibility for benefits stands. Any interruption or delay caused by this allegation will be corrected." He paused, then added, "This court does not look favorably on unfounded accusations, especially those made under oath." My father flinched. That was the moment something in me finally settled. Not relief exactly, something quieter, like a weight being set down carefully, not dropped. I closed my binder and rose. My knee protested again, but I ignored it. I had learned long ago which pains deserved attention and which were simply reminders. As I turned toward the aisle, I felt eyes on me, not the curious ones from earlier, but something closer to respect. A man in the second row, old enough to have worn his own uniform decades ago, nodded once. I returned it without thinking. Reflex. Outside the courtroom doors, the hallway seemed brighter. The windows at the far end caught the midday sun dust floating visibly in its path. I stood there for a moment, breathing, letting my pulse slow to something like normal. Behind me, the doors opened again. My father stepped into the hall. I heard him before I saw him, the uneven cadence of his shoes against tile. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could smell the familiar mix of aftershave and old fabric. "This wasn't how it was supposed to go," he said. His voice was lower now, less certain. I turned to face him. "How was it supposed to go?" I asked. He hesitated, searching for a version of the truth that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. "You didn't have to make a show of it." I almost smiled, almost. "I didn't," I said. "You did." He shook his head. "You wore the uniform." "Yes," I replied, "because you called me fake." He looked past me toward the windows. People were staring. "They were listening," I said. "There's a difference." For a moment I thought he might say my name. He didn't. He never had when it mattered most. Instead, he straightened his jacket and cleared his throat the way he used to before speaking at church meetings. "Your mother's upset." I nodded. "I imagine she is." "You embarrassed her." I met his eyes. For the first time that day, I didn't look away. "You stood in front of a judge and told the world your daughter was a fraud," I said evenly. "If anyone should feel embarrassed, it isn't her." His jaw tightened. The old anger flickered, then dimmed. What replaced it wasn't rage. It was confusion. He opened his mouth again, then closed it. No words came. From behind him, my mother approached. She walked slowly, as if afraid the floor might give way beneath her. When she reached us, she didn't look at him. She looked at me. "I didn't know," she said softly. I believed her. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope yellowed with age. "I found this years ago," she said. "I didn't understand it then." I took it from her hands. Inside was a folded photograph, black and white edges worn smooth. A much younger man in uniform stood beside a little girl with crooked braids, his hand resting on her shoulder. My grandfather. And me. "He kept it in his wallet," my mother said, "even after you left." I swallowed hard. "He used to say you had steady eyes," she continued, "that you didn't flinch." My father turned toward her sharply. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer him. She kept her gaze on me. "You didn't lie," she said. "You just didn't talk." Something in her voice cracked. "Not fully, just enough." I didn't know how I said. She nodded as if that explained everything. We stood there in the hallway, the three of us suspended in a space that felt unfamiliar and fragile. Around us, people passed, murmuring, moving on with their lives. Whatever had just happened belonged only to us now. Finally, my mother spoke again. "Dinner's on Sunday," she said, "if you want." My father stiffened, but he didn't object. I didn't answer right away. "I'll think about it," I said. She smiled faintly, not hopeful, just open. I turned to leave. As I reached the exit, my father spoke one last time. "I didn't know who you were anymore." I paused at the door. The sunlight outside was bright, almost blinding. "That's okay," I said without turning around. "I do." Outside, the air smelled like summer and concrete. A man in a veteran's cap tipped it toward me as I passed. I returned the gesture, automatic and quiet. In my car, I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, the photograph resting on the passenger seat. My heart felt heavy, but not broken. At home, Rusty greeted me with a slow wag and a soft whine. I knelt carefully and pressed my forehead to his. "We're good," I told him. "We're good." The uniform lay folded on the chair where I'd left it. It didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt like history, carried, acknowledged, and finally set down. And for the first time in a long while, the silence in the room didn't feel like judgment. It felt like space. I didn't drive straight home. The engine idled while I sat there, hands loose on the wheel, watching people cross the street in front of the courthouse, like nothing monumental had just happened inside. A woman laughed into her phone. A man balanced a box of files on his hip. Life resumed with the same indifference it always had. That more than anything grounded me. I pulled away slowly and headed toward the edge of town, past the diner and the feed store, past the stretch of road where the houses thinned out and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and dust. My knee ached in steady pulses now, not sharp enough to demand attention, just enough to remind me it was there. At a red light, my phone buzzed. "Mom." I let it ring once, twice, then I answered. "I just wanted to know you got home safe," she said. "I'm still out," I replied, "but I'm okay." There was a pause. Not awkward, just careful. "Your father..." He didn't mean for it to go like that. I know I said, surprising myself by meaning it. "He doesn't understand paperwork," she added weakly. "Or quiet people." I smiled despite myself. Neither do a lot of folks. She sighed. "Sunday's still open, no pressure." I said I'd think about it. "I know," another pause. Softer this time. "I'm proud of you." The words landed gently. They didn't undo anything. They didn't need to. "Thank you," I said, and hung up before either of us could complicate it. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, the radio off, windows cracked just enough to let the air move. When I pulled into the driveway, Rusty was already waiting by the door tail, thumping unevenly against the frame. "Easy," I murmured as he hobbled toward me. "I'm not going anywhere." Inside the house felt smaller than it had that morning, but warmer too. I set my keys on the counter, slipped out of my shoes, and leaned back against the door for a moment, letting the quiet settle. The uniform still lay folded on the chair. I hadn't touched it since leaving. Now I picked it up and carried it into the bedroom, hanging it carefully in the closet. I left the door open, not to display it, just to stop hiding it. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table, the photograph my mother had given me lying flat in front of me. My grandfather's eyes stared back, steady and unyielding, the same ones I'd seen in the mirror more times than I could count. "He saw me," I said aloud. Rusty thumped his tail. I thought about my father then. Not the man in the courtroom stripped of certainty and sound, but the one before all that. The one who'd fixed the fence without asking for help, who'd taught me how to change a tire and never explained why those things mattered until years later. He wasn't cruel, he was afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of a world where his daughter didn't need him to define who she was. Afraid of silence, maybe, because silence didn't bend to authority. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained the shape of it. That evening I took Rusty for a short walk, just around the block. The sky had started to turn that pale gold it gets before giving way to dusk. A neighbor waved from her porch. I waved back. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and realized it was true. When we got back, I fed Rusty and set his bowl down, gently watching him eat with the focus of someone who understood routine better than most humans ever would. Afterward, he curled up on his bed with a sigh that came from somewhere deep. I sat on the couch and let the day replay itself, not the words, but the feelings. The tightening of my chest when my father spoke. The release when the judge recognized me. The strange calm that followed. I wasn't triumphant. I was tired. Later, as night settled in, I heard a car slow outside, then stop. I didn't move right away. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. The knock came soft, uncertain. I opened the door to find my mother standing there alone, a light jacket pulled tight around her shoulders. She held a small paper bag in one hand. "I brought soup," she said, "in case you didn't feel like cooking." "Come in," I said. She set the bag on the counter and looked around, taking in the small space. The simplicity of it, the lack of anything she might have expected. "This is nice," she said quietly. "It works," I replied. We sat at the table, the photograph between us. She reached for it again, tracing the edge with one finger. "He always believed you'd do something important," she said. "Your father didn't know how to stand beside that." "Does he now?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not yet." That was honest. I appreciated it. Before she left, she stopped by the door. "Sunday's still open," she said again, gentler this time. "I know," I said. She hesitated, then leaned in and hugged me, brief, careful, real. After she drove away, I stood for a long time in the doorway watching the porch light across the street flick on. One by one, the neighborhood settled into itself. I didn't know if I'd go on Sunday. I didn't know what reconciliation would look like if it came at all. But for the first time, I knew something else with certainty. The truth had been spoken. And whatever came next would be built on that, not on fear, not on silence, mistaken for weakness, but on something steadier. Inside, Rusty lifted his head and looked at me, waiting. "I'm here," I told him. And I meant it. Sunday came quieter than I expected. No thunder, no last-minute excuses. Just a gray morning that smelled like damp leaves and old wood, the kind of weather that doesn't demand anything from you. I stood in my kitchen with a cup of black coffee cooling in my hands and looked at the uniform hanging in the closet. I didn't choose the dress version this time. I didn't need to. I put on the simple service uniform instead, pressed clean, unadorned. Not a statement, just myself. Rusty followed me from room to room as I gathered my keys, his nails clicking softly on the floor. When I knelt to scratch behind his ears, he leaned into my hand, trusting as ever. "I'll be back," I told him. The drive to my parents' house felt shorter than I remembered. The road curved the same way it always had, fields stretching out on either side, fences leaning just slightly, as if they were tired of standing straight. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on, though it was still early afternoon. That caught me off guard. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She smiled, not wide, not relieved, just present. "You came," she said. "So did you," I replied. Inside, the house smelled like roast chicken and coffee, familiar in a way that tugged at something I hadn't prepared for. "My father was out back," she said. I nodded and stepped through the kitchen out onto the porch. He sat on the steps with an old toolbox open beside him, sorting screws he didn't need to sort. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory, doing what his mouth hadn't learned how to yet. He didn't look up right away. "I wasn't sure you'd show," he said finally. "I almost didn't," I answered honestly. That seemed to earn me a glance. He took in the uniform the way it fit the way I stood. No smirk this time, no challenge. We sat in silence for a moment, not the heavy kind, the careful kind. "I watched that news clip," he said suddenly. "The one the judge mentioned." I waited. "You didn't look scared," he added. "You looked busy." I nodded. That's usually how it is. He exhaled slowly, like air had been trapped in his chest for years. "I thought the military would harden you, make you disappear into something I didn't understand." "It changed me," I said, "but it didn't erase me." He stared at the yard, at the old fence line, at a place where my childhood used to live. "I didn't know how to be proud without feeling like I was losing you." The words landed softly, not an apology, something smaller, something real. "I didn't need you to understand," I said. "I needed you not to erase me." He swallowed. His shoulders dropped a fraction. "I was wrong," he said. Just that. No speech, no defense. We went inside for dinner after that. The table was set the same way it always had been, plates slightly mismatched, a chip in the blue gravy bowl no one ever replaced. We talked about ordinary things, weather, Rusty's limp, the way my knee still acted up when rain was coming. At one point, my father reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and worn. He placed it on the table between us. It was my grandfather's old compass. "I kept it," he said. "Didn't know why, thought you might." I picked it up. The needle still moved steady as ever. Inside the lid, the old engraving caught the light. "Honor never changes direction." "Thank you," I said. After dinner, we stood on the porch again. The sky had turned violet, the first stars pushing through the clouds. My mother leaned against the doorframe, watching us without interrupting. When I left, they didn't follow me to the car. They didn't need to. The porch light stayed on. At home, I placed the compass on my nightstand beside the folded uniform. Rusty settled at my feet with a contented sigh. The house was quiet, but not empty. That night, sleep came easily. In the weeks that followed, life didn't become perfect. My father didn't suddenly learn how to talk about feelings. My mother didn't rewrite the past. But something shifted. Calls came more often. Silences felt less sharp. Sometimes that's enough. If you've ever been misunderstood by the people who raised you, if your silence was mistaken for weakness, if you've carried truth quietly while someone else told your story for you, I want you to know this. You don't have to shout to be real. You don't have to perform your worth to deserve it. Sometimes dignity is just showing up and letting the truth stand where it belongs. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from or who this reminded you of. We share stories like this every day, quiet stories about strength, family, and second chances. So consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sitting with this moment. And thank you to everyone who serves, who served, or who carried the weight in silence.